front of your service sheet you have the context of that message, where Jesus was speaking to a crowd of people, discovering that the crowd was so great and they were pushing in front of him to try and get a better look, to come closer, perhaps to touch him so that they might be healed. Jesus decided the best way was to step back, or to move outside, give them a bit of space, and give himself a bit of space as he went out in the boat. Perhaps with his disciples. We just hear that he got into the boat, went out onto the water. The crowd, this is the first verse of that chapter, the crowd listened to him while he was standing there on the shore. A rural community, people engaged in everyday farming activities, knowing exactly what he was talking about. He spoke a lot about the things of nature, and especially about the way that God and man cooperated to produce the food that they needed. And that's exactly what he's doing just here. There's been another parable, perhaps the most famous parable of the sower, which talks about the different types of soil in which the seeds might fall, and how there will be a different result depending on whether the ground is stony, too well drained, so the seeds rise up quickly and then wilt, or whether the seeds fall on a path where the birds eat them, or whether they fall on good soil. Understanding of the way in which the crops grew was very advanced, surprisingly advanced, many might think, 2,000 years ago. And Jesus, who lived in a farming community, whose father wasn't himself a farmer, Joseph, but a carpenter, meant that he wasn't a landed person. He didn't have land of his own. It meant that he was in a poor family. Families with land were the ones that were able to farm, but they might employ others to work with them. The people who had lost their land through maybe some big problem, they were numbered among the poor and had to take up other occupations. But most people, indeed everyone at the time, even in the towns, because they were not huge towns, everyone was connected with the soil. They had no difficulty knowing where their food came from. They spoke to their friends. They probably walked around the fields with them and watched the farmers, and certainly Jesus did. Jesus knew everything there was to know about farming and growing crops. He'd have known plenty too about the animals that they also had on the farms. Even about pigs, which they weren't supposed to have. Being Jews, they didn't eat pork. But even then, Jesus knew about. He shows that knowledge in the parables that he speaks. Parables that tell us plenty about the culture of the time, and should be able to tell farmers even today how to grow their crops. Though many would say, oh, that's all in the past. We don't do it that way now. We use chemicals. We have machines to plough the land. We have all kinds of labour-saving devices. farming is different now. It's an industry that Jesus might not recognize. Interesting. In his parable, he talks about the seed which falls into the ground, which the farmer plants, but doesn't really know how this miracle of new life happens. It's a mystery, a wonderful mystery, but he doesn't know. Far removed, of course, from today. Today we have much more knowledge about this. DNA was discovered more than 50 years ago. So we know something central about the nature of life. Although still, life itself, though we know the chemistry of it, life itself continues to be something of a mystery. The biologists will tell us plenty more details than were known in the time of Jesus. This parable is actually missed out from the other Gospels, though most of the parables of farming are included in Luke and Matthew's Gospels. Of course, John tells the story in different ways, but also has a lot about the farming community. They missed them out. One theory is that they were thinking this is about God planting the seed, the word. Now, how could it be that God didn't know how it happened? But here it is in Mark's Gospel and in the words of Jesus. I rather think Jesus wasn't on this occasion talking about God as the farmer, though that was the case in the other parable about the sowing of seeds, the sowing of the word. In this case, it's a parable about faith, the faith of a human farmer. Plants the seed, though he doesn't know why it grows, but he has faith. He knows that it will happen, that he will have a harvest, that it will grow and flourish, and so long as all other things are in order, if they don't have a drought, or if there isn't too much water at the wrong time, there will be a crop. And as often as is needed, that crop will grow strong, healthy, and produce an abundance for the coming year. It's about the farmer and the faith of the farmer, knowing that he will have food, and it's about the faith of God's people, knowing that God would continue to care for them. There was no need to worry. And in the Jewish law, there was such faith that everyone was advised and expected on the 7th year to leave the land to lie fallow, not to grow any crops, just to let it rest, as the land does need to rest. They understood that. Save up the crops from the previous years, save up some of the harvest, and that year would also be supplied. Today perhaps we understand too much about this. We understand so much about the nature of what happens genetically in the seed. We know enough even to be able to change the nature of the seed. We know perhaps more than is good for us. We can change the nature of the seed so that when we spray certain chemicals on it, it doesn't die. But all those other weeds that we don't want get killed. We can change the nature of the seed so that perhaps it will produce even more food. Companies that do this are telling us that's what they want to do ever since they started. So far, they have not done it. They have not achieved that. That's what they tell us. But it hasn't yet happened. Farmers, farming traditionally, have crossbred the plants that they have. Apples started this size and they're very bitter if you taste them. We call them crab apples in England. You would never want to pick one to eat. If you try it, you find it extremely bitter. Not worth even troubling yourself with picking. But farmers have crossbred trees that they thought had slightly bigger apples on, and actually produce the apples, the abundance of apples that we have today. And the same with many other fruits. The same also with the grain and the other crops. Just working with nature, people have been able to increase the value and the abundance of their crops. Geneticists have not yet equaled anything that farmers like those Jesus was talking about had already achieved. But this is their promise. Always saying, we must do this because the world's population is growing so fast, because we need more and more food. The cynics would say they haven't even tried. It may well be the case. Companies that do this have certainly produced crops that are resistant to their own chemicals, their weed killers. They have produced crops that even have within themselves pesticides, will kill insects when they're eaten. And the insects will get eaten by birds, and the birds will die. And I think it was about 30 years ago, maybe more, I can't remember the date, a woman called Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring. Already pesticides were being used so much then that you could go out into certain parts of the countryside early in the morning when the birds should be singing, and it was silent. If you've lived as long as I have, then you tell these stories and people say, no, it couldn't have been like that. When I was young, 5:30 in the morning as the sun came up, I would be woken up, not by the light coming in through the windows, but by the intensity of the bird song in the garden. In that part of the suburbs of London today, you see some predatory birds. You see very few of the blackbirds and the thrushes and the others that make such beautiful music. Even in Tainan you see sparrows around. And we saw plenty of those when I was young. But in the suburbs of London today, they're strangely missing. And the same in many, many parts of the world. Those people that Jesus was talking about, who shared in the mystery of creation, who saw the seeds grow and marveled at it, understood, perhaps better than we do today, how good God had been to them in his provision of the abundance of crops, plentiful, just as they could be today, if we didn't misuse the land or seek monetary gain instead of service to the community. The calculations have all been done. There is today plentiful supply of food. Enough could be available for the poorest of countries, for everybody to have quite enough to eat. So why do people go poor and hungry? Why is this abundance not shared? You know that I've been reading John Robbins' books. He's been doing the research ever since he was a teenager, I think. He's been living the life of an organic farmer in the countryside with his family. But he's been doing plenty of research. The numbers add up very easily. The amount of land that is available to the farmers in America could probably supply the world with grain. Even now, most of the countries that need to import grain import from America, Canada, one or two other countries that have a surplus. But the amount that is being produced is reducing. For the last 20 years at least, I think it was back in the 1980s that the world produced its highest amount of grain. From that time, it has been reducing. The grain in America, the majority of it is being fed to cattle and pigs and chickens. That's not a very efficient way of making food for people. Grain, vegetables produce enough protein for us. Cows, pigs, chickens produce plenty of money for certain companies in Wall Street. And I hasten to add, in London too. The cows eat the grain, not the people. And so there's not enough. But the need for meat, or at least the want for meat, is increasing. As China gets richer, people in China who have money see it as a status thing. To be like America. It happened a long time, started happening a long time ago in Britain. More and more meat being eaten. Not necessary. Of course I would advocate vegetarianism, and I'm trying. Today, the reserves of water in America, because of the intensive farming of grain, reserves of water under the ground, which have been there undisturbed, unaltered in their level for thousands of years, the reserves of water are dropping. The water is being pumped up to irrigate fields of grain to feed the animals. that water drops, land is becoming unusable. Because of the lack of water and changing climate over North Africa, the same is happening, and the Sahara Desert is moving south. But in America, it's very clear that it's people who are causing it. That water will soon run out for many farms. A few years ago, Russia, which had been one of the world's big exporters of grain, said to their customers, "We have to stop. We cannot send our grain abroad anymore. We need it for our own people." And they cut off any supplies that there had been to other parts of the world. America reduces the water table underneath. And it's underneath many of the states, this huge reservoir of water. America will have to say, we can't feed the world. Not that we can't afford it, we just cannot grow the crops. Not for you and I. We might just have enough for ourselves. For the last 50, 60 years, we have not been working together with God, together with the nature, creation that God made for us to share. We've been working against it. We've separated ourselves from it. The people who run agriculture in rich countries live in cities. You can run one company runs all of its slaughterhouses around America from one base in Chicago. You don't have to be connected with the farm anymore. You don't have to understand, as Jesus understood, how things grow. Even though those people today will say, oh, that was primitive understanding. It wasn't. I remember very well one year, every September in my church in England, we would have Harvest Festival. Because in September, that's the time when farmers are harvesting their crops, or the bulk of their crops. Even though one of our members was a farmer himself, somebody said in one of our meetings, do we need to continue with this Harvest Festival thing? Because we don't have farms all around us like we used to. We live in a town, and we're not involved in farming. When most of the congregation were farmers, or working on farms, or had some connection, then it was appropriate. But do we need to do this now? And I looked at her and I wondered, what kind of food do you eat? Where does it come from? I spoke to some students the other day, 3 students, happened to be talking about pigs. I said, have you seen a pig? 15 years old. 2 girls, and a boy. The boy put his hand up and said, yes, I've seen pigs on the farm. The girl said, no, never seen a pig. In London, there are special projects. There's a community farm where teachers can take the children to see what agriculture used to be like. or to see what animals used to look like. They don't look the same. They're in crates. They're kept in crates this size. One pig in a crate, so high, so wide, just long enough to put its nose inside occasionally. Imagine this. That's bad enough. Then there's another one. And then they decided that they could be more efficient. Why just have one layer? So they put another crate on top. Wooden slats at the bottom. 2. And we could manage 3. One pig down at the bottom. That one's got the worst part of the deal. You understand. Another one on top. And another one on top of that. In a big warehouse type building. Needless to say, in Britain, that kind of factory farming is banned. In America, it's encouraged. Because you save money, you save space. The pig stays in that all its life. We've lost contact with nature. We've lost contact with our consciences. Understanding of nature. Surely, if we look to Jesus, was fundamental to his humanity. It wouldn't have been questioned in his time. But now, the question is, why should we leave it all to nature? As my minister, when I was a child, was fond of saying, he talked about the story of the man who went to his friend and looked around his friend's garden and he said, "Oh, it's a beautiful garden. Wow, isn't God good to give us these beautiful flowers and trees and bushes? Wow, hasn't God done a good job?" And the gardener said to him, "Well, mate, you should have seen it when God had it to himself." We think we can do better. Right? We can tidy up, we can order things, we can make beautiful gardens, of course. I rather think that God had it to himself. He did rather a good job for millions and millions of years before we came along. This is just one of those parables. The one that follows, as you could see, have you read the passage from Exodus? Having read that passage from the Old Testament, you can see Jesus is really quoting from that. In that case, it's a picture of a tree that was put up on top of a mountain to grow and give shade for all the people. Ezekiel was giving, for his day, a picture of the kingdom of God. Jesus also talks about a plant. I think we might dispute with him what a plant is. But I think he was talking about plants that are not trees. Other than trees. When he said the mustard plant, bigger than all the other plants. The birds come and nest in its branches. It provides shade for the birds and other animals. All God's provision. All something which we make, the scientist, has evolved over millions of years. And we can talk about it as God's perfect planning, if you like. we know more. Perhaps we know too much. We cause disputes within our own faith between those who take the Bible story literally and those who have a scientific view of the world. But we can't get away from the fact the world around us that we have is beautifully made. It's our responsibility to care for it, to tell the stories, to encourage our children to understand, to be part of that wonderful creation, working with it and not in opposition to it. It's something that we can all be involved in. Should, in some way or other, be part of all our lives. We actually all need, like Jesus, to understand and to know our dependence on the world around us. Whether we call it God's creation, or whether we call it the Earth's ecosystem. Whatever we call it, we need to understand it, we need to work within it and with it. We have a special understanding, and that we believe this is what it means to work with God. More and more of the churches around the world understand this and are talking about it. I've shown you in the order of service. Some of the material that I got for today came from a church celebrating Earth Day a few weeks ago, as Kelly reminded us it was. As we share God's message with the world, we are sharing the message for the salvation and the conservation of the world that we know, so wonderfully described in the Bible, beautifully created by God. Thanks be to God. Amen.